My name is Emily Parker, I'm 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been measured against the weight of a name. The Parker family. In Boston, that name meant something. It meant prestige, excellence, and an unspoken standard of perfection I was expected to meet before I even knew what expectation meant. My father, Dr. Robert Parker, was one of the city's top cardiologists. His waiting list stretched for months, and patients spoke of him with reverence. My mother, Dr. Susan Parker, was just as respected as a pediatrician, adored by families across Boston's suburbs. Together, they were a dynasty, and the Parker name was practically a brand. And then there was my sister, Catherine. 4 years older, she was everything they wanted, brilliant, confident, and destined to be a surgeon. I still remember the pride in my mother's voice when Catherine first shadowed at their practice. She understands what it means to be a Parker. She didn't have to say the rest aloud. The implication was clear, I didn't. Growing up in that house felt like living in a constant audition. Dinner was less about conversation and more like a medical conference. My father shared complex cases, my mother described surgical techniques, and I sat there desperately trying to add something meaningful. Sometimes I repeated terms I barely understood just to prove I belonged. Usually, they weren't impressed. Even my bedroom reminded me that my life wasn't my own. While other girls taped posters of musicians or athletes to their walls, mine displayed anatomical charts. My parents gave me toy stethoscopes while my friends got dolls and bikes. Medicine is in your blood, Emily, my father would remind me. You're a Parker. Don't forget what that means. The irony is, I did love medicine, but not in the way they wanted. When I volunteered at a hospital, I found myself fascinated by the people behind the scenes, administrators making decisions that shaped patient care on a large scale. Where my parents saw paperwork, I saw power, the chance to improve entire systems rather than just one patient at a time. But I never said that out loud. In the Parker household, success meant a white coat and a stethoscope, nothing else. So, I tried to play the part. I worked summers at their practice, studied hard, filled out the pre-med applications they chose for me. For a while, I convinced myself that maybe if I pushed hard enough, I'd start to fit into the mold they'd carved for me before I was born. But it always felt like walking in shoes 2 sizes too small. Every approving smile Catherine earned reminded me of the ones I didn't. The first real crack came during high school when, by chance, I shadowed a hospital administrator on career day. I was supposed to be with a physician, but the program was full, and I got reassigned. At first I was disappointed, until I saw how much impact that administrator had. Staffing, budgets, patient access, real decisions that shaped thousands of lives. By the end of the day, I felt something stir in me I'd never felt while memorizing anatomy, the thought this is where I belong. Of course, I kept it to myself. My parents would have dismissed it as clerical work. And so I smiled, nodded, and followed their script. Pre-med, the right school, the right path. But deep down, I already knew, no matter how hard I tried, would never be the daughter they imagined. And one day, I'd have to choose between living their dream or daring to chase my own. By the time I reached my junior year of college, the pressure of pretending had become unbearable. For 2.5 years, I lived and breathed organic chemistry, biology labs, and endless MCAT prep courses. My grades were fine, but inside, I felt like I was slowly suffocating. The truth was undeniable now, I didn't want to practice medicine. I wanted to shape it. The breaking point came during spring break. I had come home for the weekend, and we were gathered around the dining table in our Beacon Hill townhouse. As usual, the conversation revolved around cases and surgeries. Catherine spoke about her rotations with the ease of someone born to be a doctor. My parents listened with glowing pride. I sat there, pushing food around my plate, summoning the courage to say what had been building inside me for years. Finally, I set down my fork. I need to tell you something. I've decided I don't want to go to medical school. I want to switch my focus to healthcare administration. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My father's face turned crimson. He placed his fork down slowly, as though controlling an earthquake inside him. My mother froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. That, my father said, his voice low and sharp, is not medicine. That is paperwork. Dad, I tried, my voice trembling but steady enough. Administrators design the systems that allow doctors to treat patients. They improve outcomes on a larger scale. Enough. His hand slammed onto the table, rattling the silverware. This is about you lacking the discipline for medical school. You want the easy way out. The words hit me like a punch. My mother joined in, her disappointment even sharper. We have invested everything in preparing you for medical school, Emily. The connections, the recommendations, the sacrifices we've made, and you want to throw it all away? For what? To be some glorified secretary? My throat burned, but I refused to back down. It's not throwing anything away. It's a different path, one I actually care about. The argument spiraled from there, voices rising, tempers flaring. Years of quiet resentment exploded in a single night. By the end of it, my father's ultimatum was clear. If I abandoned the path to becoming a physician, I would do so without a cent of their support. My mother, eyes wet with unshed tears, said I wasn't just betraying them, I was betraying generations of Parkers. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the anatomical charts still taped to the walls. For the first time, I understood that no matter what I chose, there would be a cost. If I followed their dream, I would lose myself. If I followed mine, I would lose them. By morning, the decision was made. I packed my bag early, before anyone else was awake, and drove back to campus in silence. My heart was heavy, but there was a strange clarity too. I had chosen my path. And though it meant walking it alone, I knew, deep down, it was the only choice that had ever really been mine. True to their word, my parents cut me off almost immediately. Within weeks, the tuition payments stopped, the allowance disappeared, and I was left scrambling. At 20 years old, I suddenly found myself filling out emergency student loan applications, begging the financial aid office for extensions, and cobbling together multiple campus jobs just to stay afloat. Gone were the comfortable evenings of quiet study and weekend visits home with care packages. Instead, I spent nights shelving books at the library, mornings working the front desk at the student health center, and afternoons tutoring freshmen in biology. My life became a delicate balancing act between exhaustion and determination. Holiday visits were unbearable. We avoided discussing my education altogether, as if silence could erase the chasm between us. Catherine, now in medical school, occasionally tried to play mediator. They just want what's best for you, she'd tell me over the phone. It's not too late to get back on track. But her words only deepened the wound. What she called best felt like a prison to me. Still, I buried the hurt beneath a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. If my parents thought I lacked discipline, I would prove them wrong. I switched my major to healthcare management, added business administration as a second concentration, and threw myself into my studies with a kind of ferocity I had never shown in organic chemistry. For the first time, my coursework thrilled me. I wasn't just memorizing terms, I was solving problems, analyzing systems, and envisioning new models of care. My grades soared. It was during my senior year that I met Dr. Maya Walsh, a visiting lecturer who changed everything. A former surgeon turned hospital CEO, she embodied the kind of career I secretly dreamed of. After a heated class discussion on emergency department efficiency, she pulled me aside. "You have a rare perspective, Emily," she said, her eyes sharp but kind. "You understand both the clinical and administrative sides of healthcare. That combination is powerful." I hesitated, then confessed the truth I had never dared put into words, that my family had disowned me for pursuing administration instead of medicine. I braced for judgment, but instead, Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Families cling to tradition," she said. "But tradition alone won't save healthcare. Vision will. And you clearly have it." She became my mentor, guiding me in ways my parents never had. With her help, I secured a prestigious internship at a local hospital for my final semester. There, for the first time, my ideas weren't dismissed, they were valued. I worked on a pilot project to streamline patient intake in the ER, reducing wait times by nearly a quarter. It wasn't glamorous, but it was tangible proof that I could make a difference. Graduation approached with no family in the audience to cheer me on. As I walked across the stage, cap and gown stiff against my shoulders, I felt a pang of grief for what I had lost. But beneath it pulsed something stronger, pride. I had carved out my own future, brick by brick, without their approval. And though the road ahead would be steep, I knew now that I was capable of walking it. After graduation, with Dr. Walsh's recommendation in hand, I was accepted into a dual master's program, healthcare administration and an MBA. It was grueling, expensive, and at times overwhelming, but for the first time, I felt aligned with my purpose. I worked as a graduate assistant to cover tuition, took on additional student loans, and lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and creaky floors. Every day was a juggling act of classes, research, and part-time work, but I thrived. When I graduated, it was without fanfare, no proud parents in the audience, no family dinner waiting afterward. Just a handshake from Dr. Walsh and a quiet certainty in my chest that I had survived the crucible. I was ready to build something of my own. That's when Massachusetts General Hospital offered me a spot in their administrative fellowship program. It was designed to train future executives by rotating them through every corner of the hospital: finance, operations, patient services, compliance. I dove in head first. In those early years, I learned to survive in a world where I was both underestimated and closely scrutinized. Many of the physicians, mostly older men, looked at me with thinly veiled skepticism. A young woman in administration, barely out of school, daring to suggest improvements to their sacred routines? It was almost laughable to them. But I discovered quickly that data had a way of silencing doubt. I didn't argue, I brought charts, numbers, and results. Slowly, grudgingly, I earned respect. One of my earliest projects was redesigning the outpatient scheduling system. No one thought it would matter much, just shuffling appointment slots, right? But within a year, patient no-show rates dropped by 27%, and the hospital netted over $1,500,000 in additional revenue. That was the first time people started to see me differently. I wasn't just another paper pusher. I was a problem solver. The hours were brutal. 60-hour weeks blurred into 70. My social life shrank to almost nothing. The few relationships I attempted fizzled under the weight of my ambition and my inability to open up about the cavernous rift with my family. Instead, I poured everything into the work. The hospital became my home, my battlefield, and my proving ground. By 30, I had been promoted to Director of Outpatient Services, overseeing multiple clinics and hundreds of staff members. At 32, I was Associate Chief Operating Officer. And by 33, I had shattered every glass ceiling I'd ever imagined by becoming the youngest Chief Operating Officer in Mass General's history. Even then, I knew titles were only part of the story. What mattered to me was how I led. My style was equal parts rigor and compassion. I demanded accountability, but I also prioritized staff well-being and patient-centered care. I had watched my parents prize prestige over progress. I refused to repeat their mistakes. Not everyone appreciated that approach. I clashed often with board members who wanted to cut corners for financial gain, and with physicians who bristled at being held to new quality metrics. But I stayed steady, guided by results. When patient satisfaction scores climbed, when infection rates dropped, when staff retention improved, those numbers spoke louder than any argument I could make. Through it all, I kept contact with my family to a bare minimum. They knew I was working in administration, but they never asked specifics. On the rare occasions I visited for holidays, I let them assume I was in some mid-level role, buried in paperwork. Correcting them felt pointless. Their disapproval still lingered like a fog, and I had no desire to step into it. The one exception was Daniel Trent, the hospital's legal counsel, who quickly became both a colleague and a friend. Daniel was sharp, witty, and unflappable in a crisis. He also understood the pressures of leadership in ways most people couldn't. Together, We spearheaded community benefit programs, free clinics, school health partnerships, that not only fulfilled regulatory requirements but also genuinely improved lives. Those programs were some of the first things I'd done that felt bigger than myself, bigger than the hospital even. They reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. By the time I turned 34, whispers began circulating. Our CEO was preparing to retire. When the board encouraged me to apply for the role, I nearly laughed. Me? The estranged daughter who had been told she wasn't disciplined enough for medicine? The young administrator no one had taken seriously just a few years before? But I applied. The interview process was grueling, endless presentations, probing questions from skeptical trustees, whispers that I was too young. Yet with each round, I leaned on my record. I showed them the numbers, the innovations, the outcomes. I spoke with conviction about my vision for the hospital: efficiency without sacrificing humanity, growth without abandoning community. When the call came offering me the position of Chief Executive Officer of Massachusetts General Hospital, I sat in stunned silence. I had dreamed of this moment, but I hadn't truly believed it would arrive so soon. I called Daniel first. Then Dr. Walsh, who had mentored me from the very beginning. Her voice crackled with pride. "I always knew you'd go far," she told me. "But even I didn't expect you to climb this high, this fast." And yet, despite the triumph, one question lingered, unspoken but heavy: should I tell my family? They still believed I had abandoned medicine for a lesser path. They still thought Catherine was the rightful heir to the Parker name. Telling them I was now running one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country would sound, to them, like gloating. Like revenge. So, I didn't. Instead, at 35, I took the helm of a hospital with a $300 million budget, 1,000 staff, and more responsibility than I had ever imagined. And for the first time in my life, I felt not just successful, but powerful. My first year as CEO was a blur of challenges and victories. We rolled out a new electronic health record system, negotiated with insurers, and secured a national award for quality improvement. Every week felt like a test, and every day I discovered new limits of my endurance. But I loved it. For the first time in my life, I was steering the ship, not just patching leaks. It was during one of our quarterly strategy retreats that fate decided to intervene. I had gathered my executive team in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Charles River. We were reviewing the 5-year growth plan, a cornerstone of my vision for the hospital: expansion through acquisition. Jessica Lawson, my chief strategy officer, stood at the head of the table, flipping through a spreadsheet projected on the screen. "We've identified 15 independent practices that meet our criteria," she said, her voice calm and precise. "Most are primary care groups seeking stability as reimbursement models change. Acquiring them would strengthen our network and diversify referrals." I sipped my coffee, only half listening, until my eyes caught a name halfway down the list. Parker Family Medicine. The cup nearly slipped from my hands. My parents' practice. The empire I had been deemed unworthy to join. The dynasty that had rejected me was now sitting on my acquisition list like any other struggling clinic. "What's the situation with this one?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Jessica clicked to the detailed profile. On the surface, strong reputation, loyal patient base. But dig deeper, and it's messy. Overhead is too high, billing practices are outdated, and their investments have been reckless. They're cash-rich but operationally inefficient. Market share has declined steadily over the past 3 years as younger patients migrate to modern practices. I forced my expression to stay impassive. Inside, irony twisted like a knife. The very skills my parents had mocked, my supposed paper-pushing, were exactly what their practice now lacked. After the meeting, I excused myself and went back to my office. I shut the door, leaned against it, and let the weight of it all sink in. My first instinct was to recuse myself. To declare a conflict of interest and let the acquisition team handle it. But another part of me, the wounded daughter who had been cut off and cast aside, wanted to be in the room when the truth came crashing down. That night, I called Daniel Trent, our legal counsel and my closest confidant. If I stay involved, it could look like a personal vendetta, I admitted. But if I step back, I'll never get closure. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful. Then walk the middle path. Don't disclose immediately, but make sure every step is beyond reproach. Extra board oversight, airtight documentation. That way, no one can accuse you of bias. So that's what I did. The due diligence process revealed even more cracks. My parents had refused to adopt modern electronic records, leaving inefficiencies everywhere. Their compensation model heavily favored senior doctors, meaning themselves, at the expense of younger associates, who were leaving in droves. Patient satisfaction, once sky-high, had plummeted. Reading the reports was like peeling back the curtain on my childhood. The practice that had been held up as perfection was rotting from within. The Parker way, the only way I had been told was acceptable, was now a cautionary tale. Prestige without progress. Tradition without adaptation. The acquisition committee's recommendation came back: proceed with an offer. The brand was valuable, the location prime, and under proper management, the practice could be turned around. When the file landed on my desk for final approval, I sat for a long time staring at the Parker name. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the authorization. With that stroke of the pen, the practice that had once symbolized my exclusion was now mine to integrate. But I didn't stop there. At our next one-on-one, I told Jessica, I want to personally lead the integration of Parker family medicine. She frowned. That's unusual. We have a whole team for acquisitions. This one is special, I replied carefully. Its culture is unique. I want to make sure we preserve what works while fixing what doesn't. I didn't tell her the real reason. That after 15 years of estrangement and dismissal, I needed to face my parents across the negotiation table. I needed them to see who I had become. In the weeks that followed, preparations moved quickly. Documents were exchanged, valuations completed, terms outlined. My parents still had no idea that the daughter they had cut off was now the one holding the reins. As the date of the first joint meeting approached, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions: anticipation, dread, even a hint of satisfaction. Years of buried pain and rejection churned beneath the surface. Soon, would walk into a room not as the overlooked child, but as the CEO of Massachusetts General Hospital. And for the first time, the power would be mine. The morning of the meeting, I stood in my office bathroom, staring at my reflection. My hair was perfectly styled, my navy suit pressed without a wrinkle, my lipstick bold but not loud. At 35, I barely resembled the anxious college student who had once begged for my parents' approval. That girl had been desperate to fit into a mold. This woman had built her own. Daniel stopped by before I left. They won't recognize you, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Not just because you look different. You are different. Are you sure you want to do this yourself? He added. I can step in. I shook my head. No. This is something I need to do. The conference room was on the top floor of the hospital, sunlight pouring through the wide windows. When I walked in, they were already seated, my father at the head of the table, my mother beside him, Catherine on the other side, and two younger physicians I didn't recognize. For a moment, none of them looked up, giving me time to take them in. My father's hair, once dark, was now entirely silver, his jaw tight with impatience. My mother looked preserved but tense, her posture rigid, glasses perched low on her nose. Catherine had aged into a near mirror of our father, all sharp angles and contained authority. I closed the door behind me. Good morning, I said evenly. Thank you all for coming. 5 heads turned at once. My mother's lips parted in shock. Emily? She whispered. Dr. Parker, I corrected smoothly, setting my folder on the table. Chief Executive Officer of Massachusetts General Hospital. It's been a while. My father's face shifted from surprise to disbelief, then to anger. What is this? Some kind of joke? Where's the administrator we were told we'd be meeting? You're looking at her. I took the seat at the opposite end of the table. I'd been with Mass General for 15 years. 18 months as CEO. But today isn't about my career. It's about the future of Parker Family Medicine. The younger doctors glanced between us, clearly sensing tension but not grasping the history. Catherine looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. "This is ridiculous," my father snapped, rising half out of his chair. "We came for a serious business discussion, not a family ambush." "This is a serious business discussion," I said firmly, refusing to call him Dad. "Your practice approached us. As CEO, I make the final decisions. So, shall we proceed professionally, or reschedule when you're calmer?" For the first time in my life, the balance of power shifted. My father slowly sat back down, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning holes into me. We began reviewing the reports, declining new patient numbers, rising costs, outdated billing, poor patient satisfaction. Each statistic was another crack in the myth of the Parker way. My mother flinched, my father grew more defensive. "Our practice has provided exceptional care for over 30 years, he barked. "These numbers don't reflect quality." "On the contrary," I replied, sliding a graph across the table. "Patient satisfaction does reflect quality, and yours has declined 6 quarters in a row." For 2 hours we danced between forced professionalism and buried hostility. Finally, we reached the heart of it, financial terms. I outlined a fair offer, respectful of the practice's value but not inflated by nostalgia. Catherine nodded cautiously. My father's face hardened. "This is insulting," he said. "You're undervaluing decades of reputation and goodwill." "The offer reflects actual performance, not history," I said evenly. "We are, however, prepared to retain the Parker name during a transition period." My father leaned back, his expression changing to something sly. "Or perhaps," he said slowly, "there's another way. Instead of a full acquisition, why not bring on a partner, someone who understands the family legacy?" I raised an eyebrow. "And who did you have in mind?" He gestured toward me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You. You could buy into the practice. A 20% share, perhaps. Apply your administrative skills, while we maintain clinical control." The audacity almost stole my breath. After all the rejection, all the years of dismissal, now he wanted me to buy my way back in. And what would that buy-in cost? I asked coolly. He named a figure so inflated it was almost laughable. He didn't believe I could afford it. In his eyes, I was still the struggling student he had cut off years ago. "That's an interesting proposal," I said lightly. "But I think you misunderstand." He waved dismissively. "I realize the amount may be beyond your means. Perhaps the hospital could cover it as part of your package." His tone dripped with condescension. 15 years of hurt condensed into a single moment. Calmly, I opened my laptop and turned it toward him. "Actually, you're the one misunderstanding," I said. "As CEO, I don't need to buy into Parker Family Medicine. Mass General already owns it." I slid the preliminary acquisition agreement across the table, the one their own administrator had signed the previous week. "This isn't a negotiation about whether the acquisition will happen," I continued. "That decision is finalized. This meeting is about transition details and leadership structure." The blood drained from my father's face. My mother gasped. Catherine stared at me, wide-eyed. "As of next month," I said, closing the laptop with a decisive click, "Parker Family Medicine will be a wholly owned subsidiary of Massachusetts General. And as CEO, I will make all operational decisions, including staffing, compensation, and privileges. Now, shall we continue?" Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. For the first time, my father had nothing to say. The silence that followed my revelation was almost physical, pressing against the walls of the conference room. My father's jaw clenched and unclenched, his face drained of color. My mother looked stunned, eyes wide behind her glasses, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Catherine avoided my gaze entirely, staring at her notes as though they might offer an escape. Finally, my father pushed his chair back with a violent scrape. "This is outrageous," he spat. "You ambushed us." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "No," I presented the facts. "Your board signed the agreement. I'm simply here to discuss transition." He stood, gathering his papers with shaking hands. My mother rose with him, though slower, as if weighed down by something heavier than pride. Without another word, they stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass walls. That left Catherine, the two junior doctors, and me. The younger physicians looked bewildered, clearly unsure how much of what they'd witnessed was business and how much was family drama. I offered them a professional smile. "Perhaps we should reconvene tomorrow, after everyone has had time to process." They nodded gratefully and slipped out. Catherine lingered. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes scanning my face as though seeing me for the first time. "So this is what you've been doing all these years," she said finally, her voice low. "We thought you were just shuffling papers somewhere." I let out a soft laugh. "I built a career, Catherine. Just not the one they wanted." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you doing this to prove a point? Buying the practice, is this revenge?" The question caught me off guard. For a heartbeat, I didn't know how to answer. Was there an element of satisfaction in revealing the truth? Absolutely. But revenge? That felt too simple. "This acquisition makes business sense," I said finally. "The reputation still has value, the location is prime, and with proper management, the practice can thrive again. If I wanted revenge, I'd let it collapse." She nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "They won't see it that way." "I know." I met her eyes, steady. "But they've spent their whole lives seeing only what they want to see." We parted with an awkward half-hug, Catherine promising to talk to them. The next morning, my assistant buzzed my office. "Your parents are in the lobby. They'd like to speak with you." I felt a twist in my stomach, half dread, half anticipation. I asked that they be shown to a smaller conference room. This needed to stay professional. They entered together, looking different from the day before. My father's anger had cooled into a stiff determination. My mother's face carried something closer to weariness. "We've come to discuss terms," my father said, his voice clipped. "It seems we don't have much choice." "There are always choices," I replied evenly. "But yes, the acquisition will proceed. The question is whether you want to stay involved during the transition, or retire." My mother flinched at the word retire. My father leaned forward. "And if we stay? Will you use this position to punish us for the past?" The directness of the question caught me. I thought carefully before responding. "What happened between us was personal," I said. "This is business. The changes I'll make at Parker Family Medicine are the same changes I'd make at any practice: electronic records, centralized billing, a compensation model that rewards outcomes, not just volume. I won't use this position to punish you. But I also won't shield outdated practices because of family ties." My mother's voice softened. "You've changed, Emily. You've become hardened." I held her gaze. "I've become effective. I've built something that helps thousands of patients every day, without the support of the people who should have been my biggest champions." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of regret breaking through. She glanced at my father, who looked as though he wanted to argue, but instead, he surprised me. "Your sister showed us some articles last night," he said gruffly. "Awards you've won, programs you've built. They were impressive." It wasn't an apology. But it was the closest I had ever heard. A small knot in my chest loosened. "Thank you," I said quietly. We spent the next 2 hours hammering out details. They worried about long-time patients, staff loyalty, their reputation. I addressed each point with clear plans: patient transition protocols, staff retention strategies, community outreach. I laid out a path forward that preserved what worked while discarding what didn't. By the end, we had an agreement. They would remain with the practice for 2 years, gradually stepping back. Catherine would continue as a senior physician but begin training in administrative skills, positioning herself for a future leadership role. As we wrapped up, my mother hesitated at the door. "Will you come to dinner sometime?" she asked softly. "Not to talk business. Just as family." I froze. 15 years of rejection couldn't be erased by one meeting. "I'm not ready for that," I admitted. "Maybe someday. But not yet." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and for once, didn't push. My father extended his hand formally, and I shook it. It was stiff, professional, but it was also the first gesture of acknowledgement we had shared in years. The weeks following our agreement were some of the busiest of my life. Practice integrations were always complicated, but Parker Family Medicine was unlike any other. It wasn't just another acquisition on a spreadsheet, it was a place woven into my childhood, the building where I had spent summers filing charts and answering phones, the place where I had once imagined earning my parents' pride. Now it was under my leadership, and every decision I made felt like it carried a double weight: professional strategy and personal history. I assigned one of our top integration teams to oversee the transition, but I stayed directly involved. Too much was at stake, for the hospital, for the practice, and for me. The first step was meeting with every staff member individually. Receptionists, nurses, lab techs, junior doctors. I wanted to hear from all of them. Many had known me in passing as a teenager, though mostly as the other Parker daughter, the one who hadn't joined the medical dynasty. Their reactions to seeing me as CEO ranged from shock to curiosity. One older nurse shook her head in disbelief. "We thought you left medicine years ago," she said. "I never left," I told her gently. "I just chose to serve it differently." Not everyone welcomed me. Some of the senior staff echoed my parents' long-held disdain for administration. "The Parker way has worked for decades," one of them told me pointedly. "Why change what isn't broken?" But the truth was, it was broken. And others saw it clearly. Younger physicians, in particular, were eager for reform. David Kim, an internist who had joined 2 years earlier, admitted during our meeting that he had been planning to resign. "The older doctors resist everything," he confessed. "They keep saying the Parker way is the only right way." Honestly, I couldn't see a future here. I gave him a small, knowing smile. "Well, there's going to be a new Parker way. And I'd like you to help build it." From there, the work began in earnest. We rolled out electronic health records, centralized billing, restructured compensation to reward quality outcomes instead of sheer volume. We redesigned workflows so patients spent less time waiting and more time receiving care. Even the physical building underwent renovations, transforming the dark, wood-paneled relic of prestige into a modern, light-filled clinic. It wasn't smooth. There were heated meetings, nights when I drove home gripping the steering wheel, replaying old arguments with my father in my head. But the numbers began to speak, patient satisfaction climbed, new patient acquisition improved, staff turnover slowed. The evidence was undeniable. My father, predictably, was the hardest to win over. He clung to the old ways like a lifeline. But gradually, even he couldn't ignore the improvements. I remember the first time he brought me a patient survey report, frowning at the upward trend. "It seems, patients like these changes," he muttered, as if admitting it pained him. My mother surprised me. At first wary, she found her footing when I invited her to lead a new community program focused on women's health in underserved neighborhoods. To my astonishment, she accepted, and soon she was pouring her energy into it. I caught glimpses of passion in her that reminded me of why she had chosen medicine in the first place. Catherine and I began to find common ground, too. For the first time in our lives, we worked side by side. She started asking me about administrative strategy, and I began seeking her input on clinical issues. Somewhere between tense staff meetings and late-night phone calls, we stopped being rivals and started becoming partners. Of course, the old wounds didn't vanish. My father still snapped when challenged. My mother still occasionally slipped into disappointment-tinged remarks. Catherine still bristled at times, defaulting to competitiveness. But alongside those old patterns came something new, small, unmistakable moments of connection. Like the day my father asked my opinion on a complex staffing issue, not to challenge me, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Or the time my mother introduced me to a longtime patient as my daughter, the hospital CEO, pride shining in her eyes. Or when Catherine and I, of all people, ended up laughing together in the break room after a chaotic morning left us both frazzled. They weren't grand gestures. They didn't erase the past. But they were the cracks that let light in. For my part, I kept myself grounded by holding firm to one principle: every decision had to be one I would make even if this weren't my family's practice. No favoritism, no sentimentality, no bending the rules. That discipline saved me from being swallowed by emotion, and it slowly showed everyone, including my parents, that I was serious. In time, Parker Family Medicine was transformed. Staff morale improved. Younger doctors stayed. Patients who had begun drifting away returned, praising the changes. The practice that had once been a monument to tradition was now becoming a model of innovation. And through it all, my family changed, too. My father's rigid authority softened. My mother's skepticism turned to cautious pride. Catherine, once my rival, was becoming my ally. We weren't healed. We weren't a picture-perfect family. But for the first time in decades, I felt like we weren't just clinging to the past. We were building something new. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was hope. A year after the acquisition, Parker Family Medicine hosted an open house to celebrate its transformation. The clinic was almost unrecognizable, brightly lit, newly renovated, buzzing with energy. Where once the waiting room had felt like a hushed shrine to tradition, it now welcomed patients with warmth and efficiency. Staff moved with confidence, workflows smooth, patients smiling. The reception area was filled with community members, patients old and new, and colleagues from Mass General. Balloons in blue and white, the hospital's colors, floated along the ceiling. Tables lined the walls with brochures about expanded services, wellness programs, and community partnerships. My father took the podium to address the crowd. For as long as I could remember, he had exuded authority when he spoke, commanding, uncompromising. But today, there was something different in his tone. For over 30 years, he began, his voice steady but softer than usual, I believed there was only one right way to practice medicine, the Parker way. What I failed to see was that the Parker way could evolve, could grow beyond my vision. He paused, scanning the room until his eyes met mine. Sometimes, it takes a new generation to show us what we've been blind to. It wasn't a direct apology, but it was close enough to make my throat tighten. For the first time, he acknowledged, publicly, that my vision had value. That I had not betrayed the family legacy, but expanded it. After the speeches, guests mingled through the clinic, admiring the renovations. My mother approached me with 2 glasses of champagne, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. Your father may never say it outright, she said, handing me one of the glasses. But he's proud of you. We both are. I hesitated, the old ache still sharp, but I couldn't deny the truth in her eyes. Even though I never became a doctor? I asked quietly. She smiled, bittersweet. You became exactly what this legacy needed, Emily. We were just too stubborn to see it. Later that evening, I slipped into what had once been my father's private office. The heavy wood desk was gone, replaced by a collaborative workspace for the physician team. The transformation felt symbolic, almost poetic. Catherine found me there, leaning against the doorframe. Quite a journey, she said, from being told you were too poor to buy into the practice to owning the whole thing. I let out a quiet laugh. That was never the point. Wasn't it? She asked, raising an eyebrow. At least a little. I thought about it honestly. Maybe at first. That moment in the boardroom, watching Dad's face when he realized I was in charge, there was definitely some satisfaction. But it faded quickly. And what replaced it? she pressed. The realization that success isn't about proving others wrong, I said. It's about creating something meaningful despite the obstacles. Every time I focused on showing them they were wrong, I was giving away my power. Real freedom came when I built something I believed in, whether they approved or not. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Different kinds of courage, she said. You for forging your path, me for following theirs. Sometimes I wonder which was harder. Both were, I replied softly. Just in different ways. In the months that followed, our family dynamic continued to shift. My father began calling me for advice on decisions outside the practice, business investments, community partnerships. My mother and I started meeting monthly for lunch, tentative but genuine attempts to rebuild what had been lost. Catherine and I became true collaborators, blending her clinical expertise with my administrative vision. The most meaningful change, though, came unexpectedly. After a leadership seminar I gave at the hospital, a young administrative intern approached me nervously. Dr. Parker, she said, twisting her notebook in her hands, my mother was one of your father's patients for years. He told me I should speak to you about healthcare administration. He said you'd be the best mentor I could possibly have. Her words stunned me. My father, the same man who once dismissed my path as beneath the dignity of a Parker, was now sending young people to me for guidance. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement that he finally saw value in what I had built. The irony wasn't lost on me. By rejecting me, my parents had forced me to find strength and direction outside their shadow. If they had embraced my vision from the start, perhaps Parker family medicine would have evolved gradually, without crisis. But then, I might never have built the resilience, the clarity, the leadership that now defined me. I realized then that healing didn't mean forgetting the past or pretending the hurt never happened. It meant building something new, something that acknowledged both the pain and the growth. It meant setting boundaries while staying open to change. And above all, it meant defining success for myself, not by someone else's blueprint. Today, I carry the Parker name proudly, but on my own terms. Parker family medicine is thriving, Mass General is stronger than ever, and our community is better served because I refuse to abandon my vision. And perhaps most importantly, I've found peace, not in their approval, but in my own conviction. Because the most powerful legacy isn't the one you inherit. It's the one you create. It's strange, standing here now, at the intersection of everything I once feared and everything I've become. When I was young, the Parker name felt like a weight chained around my neck. Today, it feels different. Lighter. Not because the weight is gone, but because I've learned how to carry it my way. It's been nearly 2 years since Mass General acquired Parker family medicine. The practice is thriving, no longer a relic of prestige, but a model of modern, compassionate care. Patient satisfaction is higher than ever, younger doctors are flourishing, and the systems we put in place have become templates for other practices. But the numbers, as gratifying as they are, aren't what stay with me. What stays are the quiet moments, the things I once thought I'd never experience. Like the day my father stopped by my office, unannounced. He sat across from me, his hands folded, his voice uncharacteristically tentative. I don't say this easily, he admitted. But you've saved what we built. You made it better than I ever could. Or the time my mother clasped my hand after a community health event, pride flickering in her eyes as she whispered, I used to think you turned away from medicine. Now I see you were running toward it all along. Even Catherine and I have reached a place I never imagined. We still spar, of course, we're Parkers, after all, but our rivalry has softened into respect. She has become one of my strongest allies, and together we've begun to design new models of care that combine her surgical expertise with my systemic vision. For the first time, I feel like we're not competing for approval, we're building something together. Still, I'd be lying if I said the past no longer mattered. There are scars that will never fully fade, the night they cut me off, the years of silence, the sting of knowing that my parents believed I had betrayed them. But scars don't mean weakness. They mean healing. They mean survival. I often think back to the girl I used to be, the one who sat at family dinners, desperate for a nod of approval, who memorized medical terms just to keep up, who lay awake at night wondering if she'd ever be enough. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this: you were always enough. You just had to find the courage to stop chasing their definition of success and start creating your own. That's the real lesson of my story. Legacy isn't about walking in someone else's footsteps. It's about forging a path that honors where you came from while daring to go where they never imagined. My parents believed I had broken the Parker tradition. In reality, I had carried it forward into a future they couldn't see. Tonight, as I walk the halls of both Mass General and Parker Family Medicine, I feel a peace I never thought possible. Not because my family finally approves, but because I no longer need their approval to feel whole. The Parker legacy is still here, but it wears a different face now. One shaped not by rigid tradition, but by resilience, vision, and the belief that healing isn't just what happens in exam rooms. It's also what happens in boardrooms, in policy, in systems that touch thousands of lives at once. I used to believe my parents' rejection was an ending. Now I see it for what it was, a beginning. The catalyst that forced me to become stronger, sharper, and truer to myself than I ever would have been otherwise. And so, I carry the Parker name forward. Not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a story. One I've rewritten, on my own terms. And that was my story. The story of how I broke away from the path my family expected, only to return years later in a way none of us could have imagined. If it reminded you of your own journey, hit like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments.